In the last few episodes of the history of writing, we covered the creation, the evolution of the modern day alphabet. And during those, we also sort of peripherally kind of glossed over the role that religion played in that alphabet, particularly Christianity. Well, today, in this episode, brought to you in part through the patronage of Ariya Norinth, we're going to deep dive into that fascinating chunk of history and look at the ways that Christianity helped spread language and writing throughout Europe, and ways in which other religions also affected writing and reading, and the ways that reading and writing affected those religions. Welcome, as always, to the history of writing. Writing and religion have been intricately tied from the very beginning of literacy, and probably even before that. I mean, there's a reason why the most ancient pictograms are all basically built around the divine. And if we take a step into true writing, one of the oldest known religious texts, the Kesh Temple Hymn of ancient Sumer, dates back to around 2600 BCE, while the Epic of Gilgamesh goes back to about 2100 BCE, and Hinduism's Rig Veda somewhere between 1700 and 1100 BCE. And remember, writing in China developed from divination rites using carved oracle bones. But it's not just that religious rites and religious rituals were documented or utilized writing. Religions also incorporated reading in writing in their very core beliefs. Siddhartha Gautama, founder of Buddhism, for instance, is often called teacher because of his emphasis on the miracle of instruction. For Hindus, education vanquishes a fundamental source of human suffering, that is, ignorance. It should come as no surprise then to anybody that some of India's most educated for a long time were residents of either a Buddhist or Hindu monasteries. The first word of the Quran is Ikra, which means read, and let's of course not forget about the 10 Commandments, carved into stone, so you know they're important. Perhaps the most widespread role religion has played in the development of the modern day reading and writing, though, occurred in Europe, where religion basically sowed the oats for all written languages across the continent, and where it also played a heavy role in actually saving civilization there. Saint Gregory the Illuminator, for instance, patron saint and first official head of the Armenian Apostolic Church, he converted Armenia from paganism to Christianity about 301 AD or so, the first country to officially adopt Christianity as its religion. And within a few centuries, Armenia, for the very first time, had a written history, had a written language. All because they wanted to develop an alphabet, a written alphabet for Armenians that they could then use to translate the Bible. This happened again in the late 9th century when Saints Cyril and Methodius devised the Glagolitic alphabet to transcribe Paleo-Slavic, also known as Old Church Slavonic, and again used it to translate, you guessed it, the Bible, specifically the Bible. I could go on because missionary monks did this throughout all of Europe. They'd go on a quest, find a place where there were local tribes, and they would bring written language with them, introducing it to the indigenous peoples, and not just for Bible translations, mind you. The monks also wrote down and made copies of many previously oral-only traditions. This helped preserve whole pre-Christian history, stuff that we never would have had otherwise. And means to this day we get to read such beauties as Beowulf, which might not even be around anymore were it not for the efforts of those Christian monks. Monastic outposts like this were the very heart and soul of literacy in Europe, particularly Western and Central Europe, for quite some time, especially after the fall of Rome in 476 AD, after which monks sought refuge in some of the most remote places that they could find, like Skellig Michael in Ireland, and continued to copy and reproduce manuscripts that would go on to preserve Western culture and Western civilization. A culture and civilization literally on the verge of extinction. In his book, How the Irish Saved Civilization, Thomas Cahill gives a better understanding of this than I could probably ever lay down. He wrote, "As the Roman Empire fell, as all through Europe madded, unwashed barbarians descended on the Roman cities, looting artifacts and burning books, the Irish, who were just learning to read and write, took up the great labor of copying all Western literature, everything they could lay their hands on. These scribes then served as conduits through which the Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian cultures were transmitted to the tribes of Europe, newly settled amid the rubble and ruined vineyards of the civilization they had overwhelmed. Without this service of the scribes, everything that happened subsequently would be unthinkable. Without the mission of the Irish monks, who single-handedly refounded European civilization throughout the continent in the bays and valleys of their exile, the world that came after them would have been an entirely different one, a world without books, and our own world would never have come to be." The culture was rebooted through the efforts of these monks. This fascinates me to no end. It's like they had an extra life mushroom. I mean, that doesn't happen a lot in history. We don't have a lot of examples of this sort of thing happening, and yet here it is. For centuries after Rome's collapse, these monasteries, hidden in dark corners of the world basically, were the only places where people knew how to read, knew how to write. Not in the world, I should say, in Europe, because there were other educated sections. But it wasn't until 789 AD, when King Charles, later Emperor Charlemagne, and still later made Saint Charles, though that was even later annulled, he united Western and Central Europe again for the first time since the fall of Rome. So some 3 centuries or so, no real central leadership there. And at the time that he became emperor, actually just a year before he became emperor, he ordered that all monasteries and churches educated any young men who wished to learn for free. And that's the kicker. Before this, it was only members of the clergy, members of the church who could be educated. So there was a period there where generations could not read or write. But here's a quote from his order. "Let the priests recruit for these schools not only children from servile families, but also the sons of free men. We wish that schools be created to teach children how to read. In the monasteries and in the bishoprics, teach the Psalms, how to take notes, hymns, reckoning the dates of movable feasts in the religious calendar, grammar, and studiously correct the religious books, because often, when students want to pray to God, they cannot do so because of imperfections and mistakes in these books." Yes, I specifically included that last part because Charlemagne is, in essence, calling for editors. Yeah, editors were important even back then. I love it. Ironically enough, though, Charlemagne couldn't write, and he probably couldn't read either. Still, his reign is often referred to as the Carolingian Renaissance because of the mass effects that decrees like that and many others of his actually had on European education systems. But the church's role didn't stop there. In 1179, Pope Alexander III held the Third Council of the Lateran, in which a new canon law was established that basically heavily impacted education within the continent. Here's how the new law read. "Since the Church of God is bound to provide like a mother for those in want, with regard to both the things which concern the support of the body and those which lead to the progress of the soul, therefore, in order that the opportunity of learning to read and progress in study is not withdrawn from poor children who cannot be helped by the support of their parents, in every cathedral church a master is to be assigned some proper benefice so that he may teach the clerics of that church and the poor scholars. Thus the needs of the teacher are to be supplied and the way to knowledge opened for learners." In short, this helped launch the European institutions that would go on to become universities. First 3 of which in Europe, at least, were the University of Bologna, which specialized in law, the University of Paris, which dealt with theology and philosophy, and the University of Oxford, which taught mathematics and the beginning sciences. Note that all of these schools were founded before Alexander's proclamation, but were not open to all. This proclamation basically allowed everyone to come in who wanted to learn. And I mentioned before that these were the first universities in Europe. That's because religion was already playing a very similar role in other parts of the world. Cairo's Al-Azhar University, as an example, was founded in 970 as a center of Islamic learning. Those students there studied not just the Quran and Islamic law, but also logic, grammar, rhetoric, and how to calculate the phases of the moon. And before that even, from around the 5th century AD, Buddhist monasteries emerged as centers of education, some becoming so large and complex they were basically university prototypes. There's one thing here, though, that you may have noticed in this little brief history lesson, and that's that everybody who was learning to read or write in these universities and these institutions, they were all men. There were some exceptions, granted, some daughters of royalty and those within the upper class, but these were exceptionally rare exceptions. In Europe, it really wasn't until the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century that this really began to change. Protestant reformers believed that everyone should be able to read the Bible. They built schools dedicated to this, translated the Bible into even more languages, such as Martin Luther himself putting it fully into German for the first time. And for them, that included women, as it should have. But this was a huge step, and not really an incontrovertible one, which, given even today, should come as no surprise. But Protestants also brought the Bible and promoted literacy along with it to indigenous peoples in Africa and in North America as well. John Eliot translated the Bible into Algonquin and published it as the first Bible printed in North America. Pretty neat, right? I want to take a quick step back to the Bible that Martin Luther translated, that German Bible, which would go on to be called the Luther Bible, pretty appropriate. He used Johann Gutenberg's, at that time, recently invented printing press. Though not Gutenberg himself, as Hans Luft actually did the printing. And he printed thousands of copies. In doing so, helping to create a standard modern German language. Yeah, religions had quite an impact on history, on the history of reading, on the history of writing, on the history of language. Impacts all of those parts of history, as did the printing press. But we will talk about that more another day. But religion continues to have quite a role in reading and writing to this very day, today. Despite the downward trend in print books, religion remains one of the consistently best-selling categories to date. And the Bible and the Quran are widely believed to be the most printed and most purchased books in all of the world throughout all of history. And despite the push towards secularization, religious institutions continue to thrive around the world and continue to educate as well. I can only hope that if our world ends in 2050, as some are predicting, that a few monks find a nice little cozy island off the coast somewhere and sit with this bank of typewriters and help preserve what is actually good about our civilization. I hope that comes to pass and we're not lost in the scuffle that is the world's change.